Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third and final lecture for Chapter 19, Japan Returns to Isolation. And I hope you guys can see the theme here in this chapter is that we have expansion and exploration primarily on the European end, and then on the Asian cultures' ends, China and Japan, they're returning themselves to isolation in a form because of European contact. And today we're going to look into Japan and the reasons for why they actually returned to isolation. It's been a while since we've talked about Japanese society, so I think it'll be good for you guys to get back into it. Now, one thing I want to point out is I want you to take a second and look at this map of Japan and look how divided it is, and think back to Europe when we were talking about feudalism developing there, because this is one of the things that's going to happen, and we'll talk about it right now. So, Japan in the 1400s, there's a lot of division that's going on in the islands, and a civil war sparks in 1467 that spins Japan into just complete chaos and violence. And this is going to be known, it's going to start off as a period in Japanese history known as the Warring States period. And a warrior class very similar to the warrior class that developed in European society during the Middle Ages, the knights, in this case known as the samurai, they're going to take control, and the samurai daimyo are going to rule the various states of Japan. Now, there is going to be a Japanese emperor that is going to be won't effectively really be in control. They're essentially a figurehead at this time. Now, this system is you can really just compare it straight to that European feudalism system that we talked about much earlier in the course. There's castles, there's serfdom, you have local armies that are loyal to their local rulers or their daimyo. They don't really have any allegiance to a king or, in this case, an emperor, and tribute is a huge part of their society. Okay. So we do have some new leaders that are going to take shape or take control towards the end of the Warring States period. We have Oda Nobunaga is going to seize Kyoto in 1568. Kyoto is the imperial capital. He's going to be influential in working to eliminate not only his political and military rivals, but he also works to eliminate Buddhist monasteries. So there's a religious undertone to his workings to seizing control. But he's going to be one of the first people to effectively use firearms in Japan. Now, to make a long story short, because we don't have time for him specifically to talk much more about him, he eventually commits seppuku or suicide in 1582, and that leads into a different form of Japanese history that we're going to talk about going forward. Now, Oda Nobunaga's best general and most capable, most loyal general was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Now, after Nobunaga commits seppuku, Hideyoshi is going to gain some control in Japan. And he gains control through diplomacy and through force. He's not just a one-trick pony just using the military to back him. He does use political ways to gain control. And as we talked about at the very end of the last lecture, with the Chinese gaining control and establishing a vassal state over Korea, Japan under Hideyoshi his group is actually going to invade Korea as well. So again, like I told you guys in the last lecture, Korea is going to face various times where they're under vassal control of primarily the Japanese and the Chinese. And here you can see Japan, another map of Japan, kind of showing the breakdown of who has control. Excuse me, sorry for the babbling there. You can see the red is where Hideyoshi is actually, the red area is what's opposed to Hideyoshi's area of control in 1582, and then you can see what Oda Nobunaga and Hideyoshi have by Nobunaga's death in 1582. So they have control of a majority of the main islands. Again, sorry for the babbling there. Excuse me. Now, in 1600, the Tokugawa Ieyasu is able to unite Japan. Now, this is going to be a pretty good period for Japan. There's a unification, which anytime there's a unification, it does allow you to have some advancement. However, because of the structure of Japan, because of the islands, and how it's hard to actually navigate throughout that, plus the geography outside of just the fact that they're islands, the mountainous terrain and so forth. Rebellions are still prevalent against Tokugawa rule, and the daimyo class spends much of their time between Edo, which is modern day Tokyo, which becomes the capital under the Tokugawa. They spend much of their time there and at their home. So there's a move back and forth. Now, the reason why this is important is because this actually brings a central government back to Japan. So there's a little bit more structure. It's still feudalistic in nature, and it's not a complete, like if you just look at Japan today, it's not complete rulership, but it's at least something that closely resembles it. It's much more of a close-knit structure than what we've seen previously in the Warring States periods, and even under Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. So this, when the Tokugawa take control, they found what's going to be known as the Tokugawa Shogunate, and this is going to last until 1867, which will end. When it ends, that'll lead into the imperial leadership of Japan, into the stages of what we kind of come into contact and know about them in their during their periods of the world wars, and what we understand about that group then. So, excuse me. Now, Tokugawa society was pretty good. I mean, like I said, they brought some kind of stability back. And anytime you see stability, you're going to see some form of prosperity. They bring huge amounts of wealth into Japan by just kind of settling down the violence and conflict. Food starts to prosper in much greater quantities. And with those two things going up, you see a population rise. Now, structurally, how their society works is you have the shogun at the top, you have the daimyo, then you have the samurai, peasants, artisans, and then merchants. It's kind of like if you think back to the feudal structure in Europe, the shogun would be what you'd call the king, the daimyo would be your upper nobility, and then your samurai would be your knights or your vassals, and then so forth. Now, they practice Confucian ideas. Again, this is something similar to what we talked about way back in chapter 12. There's a lot of cultural diffusion from China over to Japan because China is the preeminent power. Japan's going to copy a lot of that, so they have a Confucian idea set in practices. They're focused on agricultural practices, and just like we saw in China, just like we saw in the feudal system in Europe, the peasants do face heavy taxes. It's a very restrictive system on the lower classes. But you have a lot of the power and control at the top within a very few amount of people, and then most of the people in the lower levels, and they have to pay the price for that. We've seen that countless times throughout history, and in really cases we see a lot of it still to this day. Now, what happens by the mid-1700s, even though they're an agricultural society, they start to shift to a more urban society. And that's because of access to technology, that's because of growth in number of people, food, new industries that are taking forth, and that allows people to move from the farmlands to cities because they don't have enough, they don't need that many people there farming it, or they have the ability, mainly they have the ability to say, hey, look, I don't have to farm anymore, there's access to food, I can go to different jobs, and that leads to people to the cities, such as Edo and Kyoto. Excuse me. Now, Tokugawa culture, they really don't change too much. Throughout Japanese history, their culture pretty much stays the same, and that's primarily because they're an island people. It's hard to change it too much very quickly, so they maintain their traditions. They're coming out of the traditions that all Japanese had really followed. Now, samurai, which are kind of your vassals and military protectors of the nobility. They attend what we call nos, or ceremonial tragic dramas. So you have an artistic um, bring up here in Japanese culture during the Tokugawa reign. Painting and literature become very popular, and as we've seen throughout history, and as you will see throughout really any instance, anytime that you have a prosperity in more of a peaceful period, you start to see cultural things take off and become more popular and more prevalent. They become golden ages for these golden ages for art and literature. Excuse me, because of the better prosperity. You start to see new styles of entertainment develop, not just the nose ceremonial dramas, but you see haikus become very popular. And if you guys use your textbook or look at your textbook on page 544, they do give you an example of a haiku, which is just a poem of I believe it's 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, very short, and they become very popular during this time. All right, now on to European contact. Now, just like with the Chinese, the Europeans initially are welcomed. Now, Europeans, because of greed primarily, and as well as other things as well, start to will eventually wear out their welcome. Now, the Portuguese reached Japan in 1543, and when they reached Japan, they introduced many new technologies. Products. Two things that are really bad that they introduced into Japan are tobacco. Again, that's as a result of goods exchange because of the Columbian exchange. And then they introduced firearms. Even though gunpowder, they knew about it, they understood what it was, and it was invented in nearby China, they didn't have firearms before then. The Europeans bring in firearms, and this is going to completely change Japanese society. And this is where you're actually going to see a difference if you look at in history courses or look at the history of Japan versus China. The introduction of firearms is actually going to lead Japan to industrialize itself much more quickly than what you're going to see in China, even though they're going to start to limit European contact. Now, the feudal system that's in place in Japan means there's a lot of castles. There's a lot of defensible positions in Japan. However, with the introduction of firearms and gunpowder weaponry, in particular cannons, that changes the architecture style of defense in Japan, and you start to see many different forts and castles reconstructed or newly constructed to combat the new technology that's brought into the country. Now, the Europeans, they bring in, remember, it's God, glory, gold. It's not just all about money. It's not just all about power. There is an expansion part to Christianity, and Christian missionaries arrive in droves into Japan, and they're at first they're accepted because they're viewed with trading. They're viewed in a positive light in terms of an economic value. Now, what ultimately ends up happening is the Ieyasu, the controlling interest in the Tokugawa state, starts to get upset by these conversions. So eventually, Tokugawa Ieyasu bans Christianity in 1612. He thinks it's pulling back against his leadership, pulling back against their traditional Confucian values. So this all leads to certain problems. There's a rebellion that takes place in 1637. Now, again, not going to get into all the causes and all the great details of the rebellion in itself, but Christians, both European and converted Japanese Christians, are going to be held responsible for the cause of this rebellion by the Tokugawa, and they're going to be persecuted. They're going to be hunted down, they're going to be jailed, they're going to be tortured, they're going to be killed in some instances, and they even go after European missionaries and kill several hundred if not thousands of them, or exile them out of the country. And they force that all Japanese can't practice Christianity, and they have to practice Buddhism, which is the primary religion in Japan at the time before Christianity arrived. So, with this, you start to see a real true isolation led by Japan. when they persecute the Christians, the Tokugawa Shogunate wants to control foreign ideas. And they adopt a new policy in 1639. It's called the closed country or closed door policy, you might see it as in other sources. Now, there's one trading port that is left open to foreign trade, and it's Nagasaki. Yes, the Nagasaki that's going to be bombed with an atomic bomb later at the end of World War II is going to be open to foreign trade. Now, the only two that are allowed groups that are allowed to trade there are the Dutch, again for the same reason like we talked about in the last lecture with the Chinese. They trust the Dutch. They're not really as an imperialistic culture, even though we see imperialism in their veins in other areas, and then the Chinese. So what this does is it not only restricts them, it doesn't totally cut them off, but it means that there's a trade monopoly for the shogunate. So the shogunate is going to be able to control the economic aspect from a monopoly standpoint until it ends in 1867. So that's one of the reasons why they're able to not only close off the country, but also maintain power until the mid 1800s because of this restriction and control of trade. And Japan is going to remain closed for nearly 200 years. They're going to restrict people to even leave the island. So it's not just one way restricting people in or from coming in. It's also restricting people from leaving too. So it's really trying to completely isolate themselves. Now, to kind of wrap this up, Japan will open themselves up in the 1860s with the fall of the Tokugawa Shogunate. But remember, where they're different from China is that even though they're going to isolate themselves, they're much more open to industrialization and the use of technology. And part of that is because of the introduction of technology such as firearms and cannon by the Europeans, that even though they're restricting themselves and isolating themselves just like the Chinese, they're going to be able to take off much more quickly and lead themselves into an industrialized age. But again, that's for another time in this course. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. I hope that you guys enjoyed the lectures for all of Chapter 19. And I will see you later. Have a good one.